The key was the color of old blood. It sat in a velvet pouch, no larger than a man's fist, buried beneath a grease-stained rag at the bottom of a metal toolbox. And when Sarah Mills closed her fingers around it for the first time, she felt the weight of it settle into her palm like something that had been waiting there for her. Cold, heavy, patient. She was 18 years old and she had nowhere to go. The administrative office of the Clover Ridge Group home smelled the way it always had, like floor cleaner and old coffee, and the particular staleness of rooms where difficult conversations happened on a daily basis. Sarah had sat in this office a dozen times over the years for infractions, real and imagined, for reviews and assessments, and the yearly ritual of being evaluated like a piece of inventory. But this time was different. This time, the woman behind the desk was sliding a manila envelope across the laminate surface with an expression that tried very hard to be warm and landed somewhere closer to apologetic. Her name was Donna Price. She had been Sarah's caseworker for 3 years, and she was a woman built from good intentions and the kind of institutional exhaustion that comes from caring too much in a system designed to care just enough. "This is everything," Donna said. "Everything your father left in his apartment when he passed." Sarah looked at the toolbox on the floor. It was a mechanic's box, heavy-duty steel with a rusted clasp, the kind of thing a working man carries from job to job for 30 years until it becomes more biography than tool storage. She could smell it from across the room. Motor oil and sawdust and something older beneath those, something she didn't have a word for yet. Her father, Thomas Mills, a man she knew from 2 photographs and a collection of official documents that described him in the language of failure. Transient, unreliable, voluntarily relinquished parental rights at age 3, deceased construction accident 14 months ago. The paperwork had arrived on a Tuesday. Nobody had told her in person. There was no ceremony in any of it. There never had been. That is all she asked. Donna's expression shifted into something more careful. "There was also this," she said, and placed a second document beside the envelope. "A property deed, a piece of land outside a town called Havenwood, about 4 hours northeast. The house on the property has been flagged as uninhabitable by the county, possibly condemned. There are back taxes owed, about $2,000. You have 90 days to settle them or the county seizes it." Sarah looked at the deed without touching it. "There is a standing offer." Donna continued, her voice gentling in the way voices do when they are about to suggest something sensible that they know will feel like defeat. "A local developer, Raymond Voss. He has been trying to acquire properties in that area for some time. He is offering $5,000 for the parcel. I know it does not sound like much, but given the state of the property and given your situation right now, it might be the most practical." "How much do I have left on my card?" Sarah asked. $112. She picked up the deed and folded it into the inside pocket of her jacket. Then she reached down and took the handle of the toolbox. The metal was cold and solid in her grip, and the contents shifted inside with a sound like bones settling. "I will think about it," she said. It was the same answer she gave to everything she had not yet decided to surrender. She did not go through the toolbox right away. She carried it back to her room, the one she had to clear out by 5 that afternoon, and she set it on the bare mattress and stood looking at it the way you look at something you are not sure you have the right to open. She had spent 18 years learning not to want things she could not keep. The toolbox felt like the beginning of a wanting she wasn't prepared for. She unlatched the clasp. The smell hit her first stronger now, without the distance of the office between them. Motor oil, sawdust, damp earth. And beneath it all, something faintly papery, something dry and old. The inside of the box was exactly what she might have expected from a man who worked with his hands. Wrenches organized by size in fitted slots. Sockets in a divided tray. Screwdrivers with worn rubber handles. The equipment of someone who fixed things for a living, who understood that most problems in the world were mechanical, and that most mechanical problems could be solved with patience and the right tool applied at the right angle. She lifted each item carefully and set it aside. Near the bottom, wrapped in a grease-stained rag that had been folded with unusual deliberateness, was a velvet pouch. The velvet was the color of dried wine, soft and slightly worn at the folds. Sarah held it in both hands before she opened it, feeling the contents shift against her palms. The key was iron. Old iron, the dark kind that comes not from manufacture, but from decades of oxidation and handling, pitted with rust at the curves but solid at its core. The head was circular, ornate, with a pattern of radiating lines that reminded her of something half-remembered, a compass rose or the face of a clock. The bit was long and complex, a series of notched teeth that had clearly been machined to open something specific, something with a lock that was not mass-produced. She tried it on the clasp of the toolbox itself out of instinct. It did not fit. She sat with the key in her hand for a long time, turning it over, running her thumb along the teeth of the bit. Outside, someone was playing music in the hallway, something old and country. And beyond that, she could hear the street sounds of a city that had never particularly noticed she existed. She had $112. She had 90 days. She had a deed to a piece of worthless land and a key that didn't belong to anything she could see. But Thomas Mills had wrapped that key in velvet and put it at the bottom of the only things he left behind. That meant something. She didn't know what yet. She intended to find out. The bus to Havenwood took 4 hours and 20 minutes, not counting the stop at a crossroads junction, where a gas station and a diner faced each other across a two-lane road like old arguments. Sarah got off to stretch her legs and bought a cup of coffee from a machine that dispensed it lukewarm and oversweetened. The man behind the counter was wiry and white-haired, with the kind of face that had been weathered by decades of open sky, and when she mentioned where she was headed, something moved behind his eyes. "The Mills place," she said, "out on the old county road." He was quiet for a moment, his hands stilled on the counter. "Haven't heard that name come up in a while," he said finally. "You family?" She thought about how to answer that. "Yes," she said. The word felt strange in her mouth. "Provisional." He handed her change without counting it twice, which was the kind of thing you noticed when you had spent your life watching for small signals. "Good luck to you then," he said. The way he said it had layers she couldn't quite read, part pity and part something else. Something that might have been respect for an undertaking he understood better than she did. The bus left her at the edge of Havenwood at 2:30 in the afternoon. The town was the kind of small that felt deliberate, a main street of brick storefronts and a water tower, and streets wide enough for farm equipment to turn around in. She followed the directions from the deed on her phone down the main road, and then onto a county lane, and then onto a gravel track that slowly narrowed until it was more suggestion than road. She walked the last 2 miles. The toolbox bumped against her leg. Her duffel bag pulled at her shoulder. The gravel gave way to dirt, and the dirt gave way to a track flanked by Queen Anne's lace and goldenrod gone wild, the kind of overgrowth that happens when land goes untended for long enough that it forgets it was ever managed. Then she saw the mailbox. It leaned on its post at an angle that suggested decades of winters, the metal long since surrendered to rust. The name stenciled on the side was barely legible beneath the lichen. Mills. Just that. No address numbers, no decorative flag. Just the name stating itself with the simplicity of something that had been there before the road was paved and expected to be there still when the pavement crumbled. She turned into the driveway. The trees closed around her, oak and ash and one enormous silver maple, their canopies touching overhead. And she walked through the tunnel they made with the light coming in slanted and green, and at the end of it, she stopped. She had understood intellectually what uninhabitable meant. She had read the county report. She had heard Donna's voice carefully avoiding the word ruin. But understanding something in the abstract and standing in front of it are different experiences entirely, and Sarah stood in front of the Mills house and felt the gap between those two kinds of knowing open up beneath her. The house was a skeleton. The roof had collapsed at the center, the ridgeline buckling under the weight of accumulated seasons, leaving the peak of it bowed like the spine of something very old and very tired. The porch had rotted through along its western edge and leaned away from the house at an angle that made it look as though it were trying to leave. Every window was either boarded with plywood gone gray and soft, or simply absent, the frames gaping and dark. Vines had reached the second-story eaves. Saplings pushed up through the porch steps. The house was not abandoned so much as it was being consumed slowly and methodically by everything that grew. Sarah stood in front of it for a long moment. Then she set down the toolbox and the duffel bag, and she breathed. The air out here was different from the city. It was heavy with the smell of earth and growing things, and the distant coolness of a creek she could hear but not see. There were sounds she was not accustomed to. The knock of a woodpecker somewhere in the oaks, the dry sound of wind moving through tall grass, a crow calling from somewhere far away, with that peculiar insistence crows have as though they believe repetition will eventually make their point. She thought about the $5,000. She thought about what $5,000 could do. A security deposit, a bus ticket to somewhere she had chosen for herself, a few months of not waking up in the middle of the night wondering how she would eat. She picked up the toolbox and walked around the side of the house. She was going to walk the property before she made any decision. That much she owed herself. An inventory of what she actually had before she decided what it was worth giving up. The land behind the house opened up into a meadow that had gone entirely wild. Waist-high grass mixed with wildflowers, and the occasional escaped garden plant, hollyhocks and black-eyed Susans, growing in communities she imagined they had formed on their own over the years, without any help from anyone. Beyond the meadow was a tree line, and she could see that the property extended into the woods more acreage than the deed had made clear to her. It was bigger than she had expected, rougher, more alive in the particular stubborn way that land gets alive when it has been left to its own devices for long enough. She walked the meadow's edge. She found a fence line half collapsed that marked the property's eastern boundary. She followed it north, and that was when she came around a dense stand of oak trees and stopped for the second time. The barn was enormous. It rose from the high grass like something that had decided to outlast everything around it. The wood was dark with age, the color of old walnut, and the gambrel roof curved against the sky in a shape that was almost architectural in its precision. 60-some years of weather had silvered some of the boards and darkened others, but the structure itself was sound. She could see it from 50 feet away. The lines were true. The corners were square. Whoever had built that barn had built it to last past their own lifetimes, and past the lifetimes of whoever came after, which was a specific kind of ambition that Sarah did not yet have a name for, but recognized when she saw it. She walked its perimeter with her hand trailing along the wood. On the south face, half hidden by a stand of ancient lilac bushes that had grown up against the wall in a thick lavender tangle, she found a second door. A man-sized door set into the heavy timber with an iron handle and a padlock that was the size of her fist. The padlock was covered in orange rust, but the shape of it, the ornate circular body, the particular curve of its shackle stopped her cold. She put her hand in her jacket pocket. Her fingers found the velvet pouch. She pulled out the key, held it up next to the lock. The circular heads matched, not approximately, exactly. The radiating pattern on the key's head was mirrored in the decorative casting on the lock face. They were made by the same hand in the same period for each other. Sarah's heart began to move in a way she was not accustomed to. Not fast exactly, just present, awake in her chest. She inserted the key. The fit was perfect, the teeth entering the keyway without resistance, seating themselves precisely. But the mechanism hadn't moved in decades, and when she tried to turn it, it held. She put more force into it. Still nothing. The rust had done its work thoroughly, had welded the internal components into a single mass of oxidized iron. She braced her shoulder against the door and tried again, using her body weight, pushing against the key with everything she had. The developer's offer moved through her mind. $5,000. Clean, simple. No rusted locks. No ruined houses. No keys that led to questions she wasn't sure she wanted answered. Just money and a future she could navigate herself without the weight of a dead man's mystery hanging off her. She set her jaw and pushed. There was a sound like something tearing, like a year giving way to the next year, like a door that had made up its mind a long time ago and was only now being given permission to carry through. The shackle released with a pop that she felt in her shoulder, and the padlock opened in her hands, heavy and cold and spent. She pulled the door. It resisted, swollen in its frame, and she pulled harder, getting her weight behind it, and it came open with a groan of ancient wood and the release of air that had been sealed in that space for decades. The air that reached her was cold and still and thick with the smell of old hay and dry earth, and something she could only describe as the smell of stopped time. She stepped inside. The darkness was almost total. Thin blades of light cut through the gaps between boards, and they illuminated a cathedral of dust motes that swirled in the disturbance of her entry. She stood just inside the threshold and waited for her eyes to adjust, listening to the deep silence of the space, which was a different kind of silence from the silence outside. Outside was the silence of things that had stopped. Inside was the silence of things that had been paused. The barn floor was covered in decades of dust that softened every sound. The shapes around her slowly resolved as her vision sharpened. There was farm equipment under canvas tarps, a tractor-sized mass at the center of the floor, and smaller shapes around it, suggesting implements she couldn't name, plows and threshers and mechanical things whose purposes she had never had occasion to learn. Everything was gray with the same uniform dust. Everything had been stilled at the same moment, which she now understood to be the fall of 1959, and had not been disturbed since. The silence of the barn was so complete that she could hear her own breathing and the faint percussion of her own heartbeat. She moved deeper, her footsteps raising small clouds from the boards. In the far corner, set apart from the main body of equipment, was a partitioned workspace. A heavy wooden workbench built from rough-hewn lumber ran along the wall. Above it, a pegboard held a few remaining hand tools, a rusted handsaw, a pair of pliers, a hammer with a worn handle that had darkened with years of grip. It was clear to her, even before she fully understood why, that this corner was different from the rest. The dust here was a half-inch thinner, the air a fraction less stale. Someone had been here more recently than 1959. Not recently in the conventional sense, but less long ago. This had been Thomas Mills's workspace. She felt it the way you feel a truth before you can articulate it in the body rather than the mind. On the workbench, pushed back against the wall and partially obscured by the shadow of the overhead shelf, was a small metal box. Olive green, army surplus in style. The kind used for important documents or ammunition, built to keep its contents dry and sealed regardless of conditions. It was not locked. The hinge squealed when she opened it. Inside, on a bed of yellowed cotton, was a stack of envelopes bound with faded twine. Each one was addressed in the same hand. Strong masculine script, the letters formed with the deliberate care of someone who did not write often, but who wrote seriously when they did. For Sarah. She sat down on a wooden crate beside the workbench, the metal box in her lap. The light in the barn was dying slowly as the afternoon moved toward evening, the angled blades of it turning from white to amber to the color of old copper. She was afraid to open them. She had built her entire understanding of herself on a particular story, and that story required Thomas Mills to be exactly what the document said he was. Absent, unreliable. A man who had walked away because the staying was too difficult. She had made her peace with that story. She had built a self inside of it. To open these letters was to risk the entire architecture of that understanding. She opened the first one. My dearest Sarah, if you are reading this, it means I am gone, and it means you found the key, which means you are smarter and braver than I ever gave you credit for, though I always gave you plenty. She stopped. She breathed. She continued. There are 1,000 things I want to say to you, and I do not have time or space for all of them here. So I will begin with the only one that matters most. Leaving you was the hardest thing I have ever done. They told you I was unfit. I let them believe it. I am asking you now to understand that those two things are not contradictions. The farm, the barn, they are not just land. They are a legacy and a burden, and I could not give you both without explaining what I was handing you. You were too young when I left, and then too far away, And then I ran out of time before I could get close enough to tell you in person what you needed to know. So I am telling you this way. Through a key and a kite string and an old man's hope that his daughter is curious enough to follow it. Start with the barn. Everything begins and ends with the barn. Look for the place where the work was done. Under the bench. The foundation is older than the rest of the floor. Be careful. Trust what you find. And know, Sarah, please know that not a single day went by that I did not think of you. You were my true north. Every direction I moved in relation to you. All my love always. Thomas. Sarah read the letter twice. Then she folded it back into the envelope with hands that were not entirely steady and sat in the amber light of the barn and let the sound of her own grief move through her without trying to stop it. She had not cried when the paperwork arrived telling her Thomas Mills was dead. She had cried now for the first time in a barn she had not known existed until this morning, over a letter written by a man she had never met, who had loved her with the kind of love that leaves evidence. She was still sitting there when she heard the car. The engine sound came up the driveway slowly, the way engines sound when they are moving over uneven ground with deliberate care. She heard it stop near the house, a door opening and closing with the solid sound of expensive German engineering. She moved to the crack between the barn door and its frame and looked through. The car was a black sedan current model, the kind that costs more than most people make in a year. The man who got out was in his mid-50s, well-dressed in the particular way of people who want to look casual, but whose casual costs money. He had silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to walking onto other people's property without being questioned. He held a clipboard and he surveyed the house with the expression of a man doing arithmetic. Then he looked at the barn. She watched his eyes move to it, and in the moving she saw something that went beyond the professional assessment she might have expected. This was recognition. He knew about the barn. He had known about it before he arrived. His eyes moved over it with the quality of attention you give to something that you have been waiting to get your hands on for a long time. And then he looked down at his clipboard and made a note, and the note, whatever it was, made him almost smile. Raymond Voss. She still had his card in her pocket. She had never called him. He hadn't waited for her to call. She stayed very still in the shadows of the barn and watched him move around the property for 20 minutes. He went to the house first and tried the front door, which held. He walked the perimeter making notes. He came toward the barn and she pressed back from the crack, her breath deliberately slow. He walked its outer wall and stopped near the main doors, which were secured with a wooden beam and iron bolts that had rusted solid. He pushed against them. They did not move. He noted something on his clipboard. He did not find the side door. The lilac bushes hid it well, and the new padlock she had not yet put on it looked from a distance like the old one. He went back to his car and sat in it for a long time. She could see his silhouette through the tinted glass, the shape of a man thinking through a position. Then he started the engine and drove back down the driveway, and the sound of his car faded through the trees and was replaced by the sounds of insects beginning their evening conversation. Sarah exhaled slowly. She stayed in the doorway of the barn until the light was almost gone. Then she went to the toolbox she had left outside the side door and carried it in and set it on the workbench. She used the flashlight from her phone to examine the floor beneath the bench, running the beam slowly across the boards. Most of the barn floor was wide plank pine, the boards aged to silver gray and worn smooth by decades of work, boots, and the weight of heavy equipment. But directly beneath the workbench, in a section roughly 3 feet by 2, the boards were different, narrower, darker, oak instead of pine with the denser grain of a harder wood. They had been fitted into the pine floor with enough skill that you would miss the seam unless you were looking for it. She was looking for it. At the far edge of the oak section nearest the wall, there was a small notch cut into the board's edge. Not a manufacturing imperfection. Deliberate. Specific. The kind of detail a careful man leaves for someone he expects to be equally careful. She reached into the toolbox and found a thin pry bar on the pegboard above the bench. She worked its edge into the gap beside the notch. The wood resisted with the stubbornness of 65 years of stillness. She repositioned twice, finding better purchase, and applied her weight. The board groaned, Splinters let go. She pushed harder. With a sound like a secret finally spoken, the board lifted. The air that came up from below was cold and ancient and carried the smell of deep earth and something dry and still, the smell of a space that had been sealed and preserved against the years. She shone her phone light into the opening. Below the boards was not just dirt. There was a hollow space stone-lined built into the foundation itself. The stones were fitted dry, no mortar old field stonework, of the kind that takes patience and an eye for how weight distributes. And inside the hollow, resting on a flat stone shelf, was a strongbox. Metal, larger than the army surplus box on the workbench. Heavy with a brass lock set into its face that was the color of old honey. Sarah reached down into the hollow and got her hands under the strongbox and lifted. It was heavier than it looked. She dragged it out onto the barn floor and sat with it between her knees in the beam of her phone light. The brass lock was small but solid. No key. She sat for a moment with the lockbox in front of her, and she thought about the toolbox, about the organized precision of it, about a man who lived his life in the logic of tools and systems. She opened the toolbox again and searched it methodically, tray by tray. Near the bottom, in a leather sleeve no larger than a playing card, she found what she was looking for. A set of lockpicks. Small, precise, the tools of a man who understood that locks were puzzles, and puzzles had solutions. She had never picked a lock in her life. She had all night. She inserted the tension wrench first, the way she had seen described in a video she had watched once, for reasons she could not quite remember. She applied light pressure. Then she inserted the pick and began to feel cautiously for the small mechanical truth inside the lock. It was painstaking work. Minutes passed in the amber glow of the phone screen. The barn settled around her, contracting slightly in the evening cold, the old wood ticking and creaking in a language she was just beginning to learn. Then, under the pick's tip, something shifted. A single pin setting. She held the tension and worked the next pin, and the next. The process was not fast, but it was legible, and she began to understand the lock's grammar the way you understand a language, by speaking it badly and then slightly less badly until the meaning starts to come through. The last pin set with a click she felt rather than heard. She turned the tension wrench. The lock opened. She lifted the lid. The contents were packed with the same deliberateness she had come to recognize as her father's way of doing everything. On top was a stack of envelopes older than the ones in the army box, the paper more yellowed, the twine more brittle. Beneath them, wrapped in oilcloth and bound with rubber bands that had long since hardened and cracked, were bundles of currency. Old bills, 50s and hundreds from decades past, their faces the serious monochrome portraits of another era. She counted one bundle, $5,000. She counted the bundles, 10 of them, possibly more near the bottom. $50,000, at minimum. She sat back on her heels and looked at it. The number didn't feel real. It felt like something from a story which she was beginning to understand was exactly what it was. But the money was not what her father had left her. Not really. The money was the tool. What he had left her was below the money in the stack of envelopes with the different handwriting. Older ink. A different hand, more formal, the penmanship of an era when people learned to write as a discipline. She took the first envelope and opened it carefully. The name at the top of the page was Samuel Nathaniel Mills, her great-grandfather. Her hands had stopped trembling somewhere in the process of picking the lock. They were steady now, and that was how she knew something in her had already decided what she was going to do, even if the rest of her hadn't caught up. She began to read. Outside, the first stars appeared above Havenwood. The barn around her was dark now, except for the circle of phone light and the faint luminescence of the night sky coming through the gaps in the roof. The old machinery slept under its canvas tarps. The pegboard with its remaining tools cast spidery shadows. The strongbox sat open at her feet, with its decades of patience finally spent. Sarah Mills sat on the floor of her great-grandfather's barn and began to understand who she came from. The man who had built this place had not merely been a farmer. The journals made that clear within the first few pages. Samuel Mills had been something harder to name and more consequential. During the years between 1947 and 1959, He had operated this farm as a way station, a refuge for families crossing the country in circumstances that official channels could not or would not accommodate. Displaced people from post-war Europe. Later, as the Cold War settled into its particular anxieties, individuals with dangerous knowledge who needed to move without being seen. He wrote about them in careful spare language, never using their full names, but describing them with the specificity of someone who had genuinely seen them. A man who had never tasted fresh butter. A woman who wept without sound when she was handed a warm blanket. A boy of 8 who had forgotten how to sleep without one ear listening. Samuel had not done this for money. The journals were clear on that. He had done it because he was a man who believed that geography should not determine the value of a human life, and because he had a barn and a conscience and the practical skills to use both. Then the journal shifted in tone. The entries from 1959 were shorter, more careful. The language of a man watching something close in around him. Twice he wrote about cars on the county road that slowed without stopping. Once about voices in the tree line after dark. The work had become more dangerous in those later years. The people they were moving more valuable to those who were looking for them, and the attention more focused. The final entry was dated October 14th, 1959. The handwriting was still precise, but there was a quality of decision in it, a finality. Tonight was too close, Samuel wrote. A car came to the gate. We had the family out through the back wood 20 minutes before they arrived, and I do not know who they were, and I do not intend to find out. My son was in the barn when the lights came up the road. I saw his face. He is 19 years old, and he should not be carrying this. None of us should carry what is not ours to bear. I am sealing the barn in the morning. The work is done. I do not know if it is enough. I pray it is enough. For the ones I can no longer help, God's grace. For the ones we moved to safety, God's grace doubled. And for whoever finds this, because someone will I say only this. The barn is not empty. It never was. Look to what is below, and when you find it, you will understand. The journal ended there. Sarah sat with the final page in her hands. Outside, an owl was calling from the tree line in long intervals, patient and certain. The night air moving through the gaps in the barn walls was cool enough now that she could see her breath faintly in the phone's light. She thought about her father, about a young man finding these same journals decades later and trying to decide what to do with the weight of what they contain, about the choice he had made to give her distance from this place until she was old enough to choose it for herself, about the fact that he had saved money for her and left her a key and wrapped both in the most careful kind of love, the kind that costs everything and announces itself quietly. She put the journals back in the strongbox. She put the money back. She closed the lid and set it aside and stood up from the floor, her knees stiff from the cold and the concrete of the hour. She had 90 days to pay $2,000 in back taxes. She had $50,000 in a strongbox in a barn that was legally hers. She had a developer who hadn't waited for her call, who had keys to her gate, who had looked at her barn with the eyes of a man doing long arithmetic. And she had letters she had not yet finished reading. She was 18 years old. She had spent her entire life being told what she was and what she would amount to, and what was realistic, and what was available to girls in her particular situation. She had spent her entire life being managed, assessed, and eventually released like something the system had done its best with and now needed to let go. She looked around the barn, at the sleeping equipment and the dusty pegboard and the workbench where Thomas Mills had sat and thought about his daughter and written letters he never knew how to deliver. At the floor where her great-grandfather had knelt to seal a space that held 65 years of darkness and the evidence of quiet courage. She picked up the toolbox. She carried it to the corner of the barn and set it beside the strongbox. She found an old canvas tarp folded on a shelf near the door, shook the dust from it, and made herself a place to sleep on the barn floor, the way she had made places for herself her entire life, in whatever space was available. She lay down and pulled the canvas over her and looked up at the ceiling, which was so high it disappeared into darkness, and listened to the barn settle around her like something large and living making room. She had nowhere to go. For the first time in 18 years, she understood that this was not a problem. This was a beginning. She closed her eyes and let the night do what nights do, and the barn held its silence around her. And outside in the dark, the owl kept calling. And somewhere in the high grass, the creek she could not see kept moving over its stones in the way water has of continuing, regardless of what the people nearby are doing, which is its own kind of patience, its own kind of faith. In the morning, she would look more carefully at the floor of the barn. In the morning, she would read the rest of the letters. In the morning, she would figure out what exactly Raymond Voss thought he was doing with keys to her gate. But that was morning. For now, she slept in her great-grandfather's barn with the key in her hand and everything still ahead of her. And she did not dream about the house she had grown up in or the city that had never learned her name. She dreamed about the smell of old wood and the sound of a lock opening. And in the dream, the feeling was not fear. It was arrival. She woke before the light came. The barn was still dark except for the faint gray seeping through the gaps in the eastern wall, thin as pencil lines, the kind of light that arrives before it announces itself. Sarah lay still for a moment under the canvas tarp and listened. The owl was gone. In its place were the first birds, 2 or 3 of them, beginning the tentative back and forth that would become in another hour the full conversation of morning. She had slept better than she had any right to. She sat up and looked around the barn in the early gray, and it was different in this light than it had been by the phone's beam the night before. Larger somehow. The shapes of the covered equipment resolved slowly from the dark, like things being remembered rather than seen for the first time. The pegboard with its remaining tools. The workbench with its ghost outlines of tools long removed. The strongbox on the floor beside her with its brass lock that she had opened with her father's picks and her own stubbornness. She stood and folded the canvas tarp with the automatic tidiness of someone who had spent years in shared spaces where leaving things in disarray had consequences. Then she unlocked the side door and stepped outside. The morning air was cold and clean and carried the smell of damp grass and something floral she couldn't identify. The lilacs, she realized, still blooming late or blooming again. The light in the east was the color of a peach left out too long soft and slightly bruised, and the sky above it was the deep blue of the last hour before full day. She walked the perimeter of the barn, slowly looking at the ground. She found the footprints on the north face. They were not hers. She had not come around this side of the barn last night. These prints were in the soft earth between the barn wall and the tree line, where the grass thinned and the ground held shape, and they were recent enough that the dew had not fully settled into them. Larger than her feet, flat-soled, deliberate in their placement, not the prints of someone walking, but of someone standing and then moving carefully. Someone had been here after dark. She crouched over the prints for a long time. They came from the tree line and went to the barn wall and stopped there, and then they went back to the tree line. Whoever it was had stood at the wall for several minutes. She judged by the depth of the impression and then left the way they came. She stood and looked at the tree line. Nothing moved. She went back inside and made a decision she would not examine too closely, because examining it would require her to admit how little she knew about what she was doing. She moved the strongbox. She carried it to the back of the barn, to a section she had not yet fully explored, where the hayloft ladder rose into the upper darkness, and where the floor space was crowded with old equipment, stacked close enough together that navigating it required turning sideways. She found a space between 2 large pieces of machinery whose tarps had fused to them with decades of dust, and she worked the strongbox into the gap until it was invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. She put the olive green army box back on the workbench where she had found it. If someone came looking, they would find what they expected to find. An empty box. The kind of discovery that would tell her exactly who was looking and what they already knew. Then she sat down with the remaining letters. Her father's letters came first in chronological order, the earliest dated 4 years ago. They were written over the course of those 4 years, with varying intervals between them, sometimes months, sometimes only weeks. They were the letters of a man working through something, slowly reaching conclusions in the order that reality presented them to him. He wrote about finding Samuel's journals when he was in his early 30s, inheriting the farm from his own father, who had sealed the barn again after Samuel's death in 1972 and never spoken of it. He wrote about the shock of understanding what the barn had been, about the attempts to figure out what obligation that history placed on him. He wrote about watching from a distance as Sarah grew through channels she would not want to know about, through people he trusted at the group home, who sent him information without knowing they were doing so. He wrote about the year she turned 15 and how he had nearly come to Clover Ridge 3 times and turned back each time convinced that showing up would do more harm than arriving in her life as a man with a complicated inheritance that she wasn't ready for. The last letter, written 8 months before the construction accident, was the longest. I have found the way he wrote. There is a nonprofit organization called the Harlan Foundation. They resettle families who have no other options. A modern version of what your great-grandfather did here, without the secrecy, without the danger, with proper legal support and actual funding. I met with their director last month. She said the farm could be a residential facility, a place for newly arrived families to stay while they find their footing. I told her I had a daughter who needed to be the one to decide what happened to the land. She said to take whatever time I needed. I am going to tell you everything, Sarah. I am coming to Clover Ridge in the spring. I have been a coward about this for too long, and I am done being a coward. Whatever you decide to do with this place, that is your right. But you deserve to know what it is before you decide. There is one more thing. If for any reason I cannot come, if something happens before spring, find August Bryn in Havenwood. He is 80-some years old, and he has lived in that town his whole life, and he knows more about this barn than he has ever told anyone. He was there. He will explain. Trust him. He was a boy when my grandfather kept him safe. He has spent his whole life being grateful in silence. It is time for that silence to end. All my love. Always. I am coming in the spring. Thomas. He had not come in the spring. Sarah folded the letter and held it in both hands and breathed steadily in the way she had learned to breathe when things moved inside her that she could not afford to let out entirely. The grief was still there, the same as last night, but this morning it had a different shape. Last night it had been the grief of learning she had been loved. This morning it was the grief of understanding how close it had all come to being different. 8 months. He had been 8 months away from the spring. She put the letters back in their envelopes, and the envelopes back in their order, and the order back into her jacket pocket. Then she picked up the pry bar from the workbench and went back to the section of oak flooring under the bench that she had already opened once. She had replaced the board last night, fitting it back into its slot by feel, not wanting to leave the hollow visible and unattended while she slept. Now she pried it up again more easily this time, the wood remembering the insult of yesterday's leverage. She shone the phone light into the hollow. The hollow was deeper than she had fully assessed last night. The strongbox had sat on the first shelf, but beneath the shelf, she could now see the stone-lined space continued downward. There were 2 more shelves below the first, and on the lowest one, partially obscured by the shadow of the stones, was a wooden hatch. Small. Set flush with the bottom of the hollow with an iron ring for a handle. She had not seen this last night. She had found the strongbox and stopped looking. She lowered herself carefully into the hollow, fitting her feet onto the first shelf, and then the second, and crouched at the bottom. The hatch was about 2 feet square, the wood thick and reinforced with iron strapping. She pulled the ring. The hatch opened downward on hinges that had been oiled more recently than anything else she had found, and the space below was not the crawl space she expected. It was a room. A full room, low-ceilinged but wide stone-walled, earthen-floored, extending beneath the barn in a direction she estimated was toward the tree line. She dropped through and stood upright barely. The room was dim-lit only by the phone light, but she could see what was in it. Along the walls were wooden frames that had once held mattresses, 4 of them, now holding only the dry ghost of the straw that had stuffed them. There were shelves with the remnants of old provisions, empty tin cans, a ceramic jug, a box of matches so old the wood had calcified. There was a small iron stove connected to a pipe that disappeared into the ceiling and must have vented somewhere outside, somewhere hidden. There was a lantern hanging from a ceiling beam, empty of oil but intact. And on the wall nearest the stove, fixed to the stone with 4 iron pegs, was a list. It was written on paper that had been treated with something oilcloth or wax, some preservative, that had kept it readable through the decades. The handwriting was Samuel's. She recognized it now. 23 entries. Each one a date, a number of people, and a notation. Family of 4 passage arranged. Man traveling alone passage arranged. Woman and 2 children. 3 men from separate origins arranged together for the Western route. The list spanned 1947 to October 1959. No names. Samuel had been careful. No names meant nothing to find if the wrong people came looking. She stood in the cold underground room and read the list twice. 23 groups. She did not know how to count the individuals precisely without the full entries, but it was dozens of people, possibly more than 100. Moved through this farm, hidden in this room, sent west to lives that would not have happened otherwise. Her great-grandfather had done this alone or nearly alone in a period when such activity could have destroyed his family. He had done it because he believed it was right. And when the risk had climbed high enough to threaten his son, he had sealed the barn and walked away and never told anyone, which was its own kind of courage, the courage of knowing when to stop. She climbed back out of the room and through the hollow and replaced the board. Then she walked the 2 miles into Havenwood. She found the county clerk's office in a brick building on the square, not yet open for the morning. She sat on the steps until it opened at 8:30, and then she went in and paid the $2,000 in back taxes from one of the bundles of bills, counting it out on the counter, while the clerk watched her with an expression that was trying to be neutral and only partially succeeding. The clerk stamped a form with a satisfying authority and slid it across the counter. And just like that, the land was hers in a way it had not been when she woke up. She folded the receipt and put it in her jacket with the letters. Then she went to find August Bryn. It took her most of the morning. She asked at the hardware store, where a young man behind the counter thought for a moment and said there was an older gentleman by that name who lived out on Sycamore Road, the blue house with the porch swing. She walked Sycamore Road and found the blue house, which was the color of a September sky and had a porch swing that was currently occupied by a man of advanced age who was drinking coffee and looking at the tree in his front yard with the particular attention of someone who has been looking at the same tree for a very long time and still finds it interesting. She opened the gate. He watched her come up the walk without moving. August Bryn was 84 years old and had the physical quality of old timber reduced to its essential grain by the passing of unnecessary material. His face was a landscape of completed weather. His hands around the coffee mug were large and still the hands of a man who had worked with them for decades and was now content to let them rest. His eyes were the color of creek water, clear and still, and deep enough that you couldn't see the bottom. He looked at her for a long moment. "You look like Thomas," he said. The voice was slow and deliberate, each word given its full weight. "But the eyes are Samuel's." She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. "You knew my father," she said. "Knew of him," August said. "Met him twice. He came to see me when he found the journals. Sat right where you're standing and asked me if I remembered." He paused. "I told him I remembered everything. You don't forget the people who keep you alive." She sat down on the bottom porch step without being invited, which was not rudeness, but necessity. Her legs had decided. "Tell me about Voss," she said. August's expression did not change, but something in it sharpened. "Raymond Voss," he said. "He was Thomas's attorney. Not the family attorney Thomas hired him later when he was trying to get the nonprofit arrangement set up. Legal work around the land transfer." He said nothing for a moment. Man like Voss doesn't work on nonprofit land transfers out of the goodness of his heart. He saw the arrangement paperwork, understood what the property might be worth to the right developer. Thomas told me in the second visit that he was beginning to think Voss was moving information in 2 directions. "What kind of information?" she said. "Zoning. Future development plans for the county. The kind of thing that tells you what land will be worth in 10 years if you have the right friends in planning." He paused again and drank his coffee. Thomas was going to fire him. He said so. He said he had found some things in the arrangement documents that didn't sit right. He was going to take it to someone. He never got the chance. The construction accident, Sarah said. August said nothing to that. He looked at his tree. Was it an accident? Sarah said. I don't know, August said. I have thought about it for 14 months and I don't know. I know that Raymond Voss was at that site on the day Thomas died. I know because Thomas called me that morning and mentioned it. Said Voss wanted to meet him there. Said it was about the land transfer. Said he would call me in the evening. He paused. He did not call me in the evening. Sarah was quiet for a moment. The street was quiet too. A dog somewhere on the next block. A car slowing for the stop sign at the corner. What do you know about the barn? She asked. August set down his coffee mug. He looked at her with the directness of someone who has been waiting for a particular question for a long time and is relieved to finally hear it. I was 7 years old, he said. My family came through in the winter of 1952. We had been traveling for 4 months. He paused, choosing the word carefully in a situation where our options had narrowed to essentially one. Samuel Mills met us at the county road at 2 in the morning. He was alone. He brought us to the farm in his truck with the lights off, and he hid us in that room beneath the barn for 11 days while he arranged our passage west. He fed us. He kept his son away so the boy wouldn't know to protect him. He asked for nothing. When we left, my father tried to give him money and he refused it. He said it wasn't about money. He said it was about the kind of country he wanted to live in and the kind of man he wanted to be. He picked up his coffee mug again. I have lived in this town for 84 years, he said, and I have never told that story to anyone but Thomas. Samuel asked us not to, said it was safer for everyone if the connection didn't exist on paper or in conversation. We honored that, even after he died, even after it was probably safe to speak. Some silences become part of you. He looked at her. I think it is time to stop being silent, he said. She asked him one more question before she left. She asked about the list on the wall of the underground room, the 23 entries. He nodded slowly. I remember seeing him write on it, he said. He kept records without names, in case anything happened to him and someone needed to understand what the barn had been. He said the record was for whoever came after, so they would know the work was real. He paused. Do any of the families have descendants you could find? One of them, she said. She had thought about this on the walk from the barn to town, turning the pages of Samuel's journal in her memory, stopping at the entries she had noticed, and then returned to. One family entered in 1952. He wrote only their initial. H family of 3 passage arranged western route. She had sat with that initial in the early morning light and done the slow arithmetic of possibility. She told August the name she was thinking of. He went very still. Judge Lenora Hargrove, he said, of the 7th Circuit. You know her, Sarah said. I know of her, he said. Her father was a man named Edmund Hargrove. He came here as a boy. His family. He was 8 years old when they passed through. He became a school teacher. His daughter became a federal judge. He paused. He died 3 years ago. He never knew the name of the man who hit his family. He told me that once at a civic function, said it was the one question he had never been able to answer. Sarah stood up from the porch step. I need to make a phone call, she said. She walked back to the main street and sat on a bench outside the hardware store and looked up the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals on her phone and found a public contact number for Judge Lenora Hargrove's chambers and called it and spoke to a clerk who told her in a polished voice that the judge's schedule did not permit unsolicited meetings. She asked the clerk to pass along a message. She said her name was Sarah Mills, that she was the great-granddaughter of Samuel Mills of Havenwood, and that she had in her possession a document from 1952 that contained information about the judge's father's history that Judge Hargrove had never been able to learn. She asked the clerk to convey that she was willing to share this information and that she thought the judge would want to know it existed. She left the number of the prepaid phone she had bought at the gas station on the county road. Then she walked back to the farm. She spent the rest of the afternoon doing what she knew how to do, which was to make herself useful in the space available. She cleared the worst of the overgrowth from the path to the barn. She swept the workbench and organized the remaining tools on the pegboard. She made a list on a piece of paper she found in her duffel bag of what the barn would need, and the list was long but not impossible, and she had the skills or would learn them, which in her experience amounted to the same thing given enough time. At 4 in the afternoon, a car turned into the driveway that was not the black sedan. It was a county vehicle, and the man who got out of it was a building inspector named Croft, who had a clipboard in a manner of professional detachment. He informed her that the house had been formally condemned the previous year and that she would need to address certain structural issues before any habitation would be permitted. She thanked him and got his card and asked him what the minimum requirements were for the condemnation to be lifted. He told her. She wrote it down. He looked at her with the expression of a man trying to calibrate what he was dealing with and settling on cautious respect. After he left, she called Donna Price. Donna answered on the second ring, and her voice went through several stages in quick succession when she heard Sarah's voice. Relief, then concern, then the particular tension of someone trying to determine how much bad news they are about to receive. I paid the taxes, Sarah said. I am keeping the property. Donna was quiet for a moment. Sarah, honey, how did you... The property had resources I did not know about. Sarah said, I have what I need. Another pause. Are you sure about this? Do you have somewhere safe to sleep? She looked at the barn. Yes, she said. She meant it. Donna asked several more questions, all of them variations on the same question, which was whether Sarah had thought this through, and Sarah answered them all with the same patience she had always had for Donna's particular brand of worry, which was genuine and therefore worth respecting. At the end of the conversation, Donna said in a different voice than the professional one, the voice of someone speaking as themselves rather than as a caseworker. I hope this is what I hope it is for you. Sarah said thank you and meant that too. She made dinner from the supplies she had bought at the gas station trail mix and a sandwich that had seen better days and ate sitting on the workbench with her legs dangling, reading through the rest of Samuel's journals in the phone light. The later entries were quieter in tone than the early ones, more reflective. He wrote about the farm itself with the love of a man who had worked a piece of ground long enough to know it personally, which fields drained slowly after rain, where the soil went thin over the limestone, the particular behavior of the creek in flood years. He wrote about his son with a careful pride that you could see him measuring and restraining because he was a man of that generation and that place, and did not come easily to sentiment. And he wrote in the final entries of 1959 about the decision to seal the barn with a grief that was quiet and complete. I am leaving a record, he wrote in one of the last entries, in the sealed room, for whoever finds it. I am leaving what I have to leave, and I am trusting that the right person will find it at the right time. That is all any of us can do. Leave something behind that tells the truth and trust that truth to travel. The phone rang at 8:17 that evening. She answered it without looking at the number. Miss Mills. The voice was measured and precise, the voice of a woman accustomed to the weight of words. This is Judge Lenora Hargrove. I understand you have information about my father. Sarah sat very still. I do, she said. Tell me, the judge said. She told her. Not everything, not the full history, but the essential pieces. Samuel Mills, 1952, a room beneath a barn, a family of 3 given 11 days of shelter in a passage west. The initial H in the journal, the only identification Samuel had allowed himself. The judge was silent for a long time after she finished. My father, she said finally, and her voice had changed. It was still measured, still precise, but there was something moving in it now, something that had been sealed for a long time and was being let out carefully. My father spent his whole life trying to find out who helped them. He hired researchers. He wrote letters to historical societies. He never found anything. He said it was the one piece of himself he could never locate. He protected them by leaving no record, Sarah said. His name was Samuel Mills. He died in 1972. He was a farmer, and before that, he was something harder to name. She heard the judge breathing. Why are you telling me this, the judge said. Because I need help, Sarah said, and because you deserve to know. Both things are true. She explained about the property, about Raymond Voss and his clipboard, and the keys to her gate. She explained about the arrangement documents that Thomas had been suspicious of before he died, and about the timeline she had worked out the date discrepancy that proved the signature was forged. She said she had a hearing pending and that she had documentation and a dead man's letters and the testimony of a man who had waited 84 years to say what he knew. I am not in a position to intervene in a civil dispute in a jurisdiction where I do not sit, Judge Hargrove said. Her voice was careful again, professional. I know, Sarah said. I am not asking you to intervene. I am asking if you would be willing to be a witness. Not a judge, a person, a daughter of someone my great-grandfather once kept safe. The silence this time was shorter. Where is the hearing? Judge Hargrove said. The next 3 days passed in the way that high-stakes time always passes too fast in some moments and too slow in others, with the peculiar quality of time that is running toward something. Sarah spent them learning the barn. She pulled every tarp from every piece of equipment and cataloged what was there. She found a tractor that she thought might actually still run if someone who knew what they were doing looked at it. She found a candle press and a wooden apple mill and hand tools of a precision and quality that she recognized instinctively as the product of a different era's standards, built to last past anyone's ability to predict the future. She ate gas station food and slept under the canvas tarp, and woke up early every morning and walked the property line in the gray light and thought. On the second morning, she found evidence that someone had again been at the north wall of the barn after dark. The same flat-soled prints, deeper this time, because the ground was softer after overnight rain. She photographed them with her phone and said nothing to anyone. On the third morning before dawn, she went back to the underground room. She had been in it twice now and had been thorough, or thought she had been, but Samuel's journal entry stayed with her. I am leaving a record in the sealed room. She had found the list on the wall, but the entry also said something else. Leave something behind that tells the truth and trust that truth to travel. The list told the story, but a list was not a document with legal weight. She took the phone light and examined the room more carefully than she had before. The stone walls, the wooden shelves, the stove and the pipe, the 4 bed frames. She went over every surface, slowly looking for what she might have missed. It was on the interior face of the hatch itself, which she had only seen from above and from the side. When she climbed back into the hollow and crouched and looked at the underside of the closed hatch from the room below, she saw what had been fixed to it. A metal box, small the size of a hardcover book, bolted to the wood with iron bolts that had not corroded because whoever had installed them had packed them with grease. The box was sealed with a lid that was itself bolted shut, 4 bolts on its face. She found a wrench in the pocket of the canvas tool roll she had brought down with her and removed the bolts one by one, her hands steady, her breathing slow. The lid came off. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had done its job for 65 years, was a document. 2 pages handwritten in Samuel's formal penmanship, and below the handwriting, a notary stamp. Dated October 13th, 1959. 1 day before the final journal entry. It was a sworn affidavit. Samuel had written it in the legal form of the era, precise and careful, attested to by a notary whose name and seal were still legible. It described the property in full. It attested to his sole ownership and to the conditions of that ownership, the original land grant, the chain of title, the absence of any encumbrance. It stated explicitly that the property was to pass to his direct descendants and was not to be sold divided or transferred to any party outside the family without the unanimous consent of all living descendants in each generation. At the bottom, in larger letters than the rest, he had written one sentence that was not legal language. This place is not for selling. It is for keeping people safe. Beneath that, the notary's seal. Beneath that, Samuel Nathaniel Mills, his full signature completed with the deliberate care of a man who understood that what he was signing would outlast him. A sworn affidavit, valid chain of title, explicit restrictions on transfer, notarized and preserved for whoever came after. Sarah sat in the underground room with the document in her hands and thought about Raymond Voss and his forged contract and his clipboard and the keys to her gate and the prints in the soft earth outside the north wall. She thought about a man who had spent years calculating the value of a piece of land without ever understanding what was underneath it. She thought about the hearing. She climbed out of the room and replaced the hatch and replaced the floorboard and put the affidavit in her jacket pocket with Thomas's letters. She walked out into the early morning, which was clean and gold, and full of the sound of birds doing their uncomplicated work, and she stood in front of the barn and looked at it in the way you look at something you are beginning to understand. She had gone into that first night with a key and $112 and the reasonable expectation that she would sell the property and start over somewhere that had no history attached to it. She had spent 3 days discovering that the history was not a burden, but a foundation, that the foundation was not crumbling, but intact, that the people who had come before her had not left her with nothing but had left her with everything she needed, hidden carefully in the places you only found if you were paying attention. Raymond Voss was not paying attention. He was doing arithmetic. He was calculating square footage and zoning variances and development timelines. And he was very good at his calculations. And his calculations did not include underground rooms or sworn affidavits or the possibility that the girl he had tried to buy off for $5,000 had spent the last 3 days discovering exactly what she owned. That evening, well after dark, she heard a car on the county road slow and stop, and then move on without turning into the driveway. 20 minutes later, she heard something in the tree line, not the movement of an animal, but the deliberate and human sound of someone who was trying not to be heard. She sat very still in the dark barn and listened and did not turn on her light. She heard the side door handle move. She had replaced the old padlock with a new one she had bought in town, a modern lock that Voss's people could not open with any key he might have had made. The handle moved and then stilled, and then there was a long silence, and then the sound of footsteps retreating through the long grass toward the tree line. She sat in the dark for a long time after the sound was gone. Then she got up and moved to the workbench and opened the olive green army box and removed the bundle of envelopes and replaced them with a folded piece of paper on which she had written in her own handwriting a single sentence. "You are looking in the wrong place." She closed the lid and went back to her sleeping place and lay down under the canvas and looked up into the darkness of the barn's high ceiling and listened to the night settle back into itself. In the morning, she checked the army box before she did anything else. She lifted the lid slowly. The folded note was gone. Someone had found a gap she had not noticed, a rotted knot in the siding low on the south wall, just wide enough for a hand. They had reached through in the dark and opened the unlocked army box and taken what was inside. They had read her note. She stood at the workbench for a moment and considered what that meant. Then she almost smiled. They had come for the journals and found a message instead, which meant Voss now knew she knew he was watching. And a man who knows he has been seen tends to rush. Rushing men make mistakes. She had a hearing in the morning, and she was ready for whatever mistakes he brought into that room. In the morning, there was a hearing. In the morning, she would see what Raymond Voss brought to a room in which she intended to bring the truth. She was not afraid. She had her great-grandfather's document, and her father's letters, and August Brin's testimony, and the record on the wall, and 65 years of careful, deliberate, quietly heroic history on her side. And she had something else, something that Voss, in all his careful calculation, had never thought to account for. She had been raised with nothing her whole life. She knew how to make everything out of it. The morning of the hearing arrived the way important mornings do, quietly, without announcement, as if the day had decided not to make a fuss about what it contained. Sarah woke at 5 and lay still for a moment under the canvas tarp, listening to the barn around her. It had become familiar to her in these few days, the way old wood sounds when the temperature shifts, the particular creak of the main beam above the loft, the soft percussion of a branch against the south wall when the wind came from the east. She had learned the barn the way you learn a language, by living inside it. Not by studying it, but by simply being present until the sounds began to make sense. She got up and folded the canvas and set it on the shelf where she kept it now. She had laid out her clothes the night before. She owned two outfits that could be called presentable, and she wore the better one. Dark jeans without holes. A gray button-down shirt that she had pressed as well as she could with a damp cloth and the flat edge of the strongbox. Her boots were work boots, and there was nothing to be done about that, so she did not try. She was who she was. A girl of 18 in work boots who had just paid her dead father's back taxes and found 65 years of hidden history under the floor of a barn. She did not need to look like someone else to make that true. She checked her jacket pocket. Thomas's letters, the sworn affidavit in its oilcloth wrap, the photograph she had taken of the underground room and the list on the wall, and the footprints in the soft earth outside the north wall. The document the clerk had stamped when she paid the taxes folded and refolded until the creases were soft. She walked the 2 miles to town in the early morning light. Havenwood's municipal building was a brick structure on the east side of the square, 2 stories, American flag and state flag on poles out front, the kind of building that had been built to communicate civic seriousness and had succeeded. The hearing was in a conference room on the second floor, not a courtroom, because it was not that kind of proceeding. Not yet. It was an emergency disposition hearing regarding a disputed contractual claim, which was the formal language for what it actually was, which was Raymond Voss attempting to take what was not his in a room with good lighting and a court reporter. She arrived at 8:15. The hearing was at 9. August Bryn was already there. He was sitting in the hallway outside the conference room on a wooden chair, dressed in a dark suit that had the quality of something kept for important occasions, well-maintained and slightly formal, the suit of a man who understood that some moments required a different kind of presence. He had a manila folder on his knees. He looked up when she came down the hall, and his creek water eyes assessed her with the calm of someone who has been through enough difficult mornings to know that calm is the most useful thing you can bring to one. "You slept," he said. It was not a question. She had. Better than she expected. "Good," he said. "Frightened people do not sleep. You are not frightened." She sat down in the chair beside him. "I did not say I was not frightened." "No," he said. "But you slept." He paused. "Your great-grandfather never slept the night before something difficult. He told me that once. He said the not sleeping was the only thing that ever made him feel his age." He paused again. "You slept." At 8:40, Voss arrived. He came down the hallway with 2 men she didn't recognize, both of them in suits that cost more than a month of anything she had ever owned. Both of them carrying briefcases and wearing the expression of people who believe that preparation and expense are the same thing as being right. Voss himself was in a charcoal suit with a blue tie and the bearing of a man who had done this many times and was not concerned about doing it once more. He was silver-haired and broad-shouldered, and he moved with the confidence of someone who had spent decades being the most powerful person in most rooms. He saw her from 20 feet away, and his pace did not change, and his expression did not change, and that she thought was itself information. He had expected her to be here. He had not expected her to be calm. He stopped in front of her. "Miss Mills," he said. His voice was smooth and controlled, the voice of a man who had practiced it. "I want you to know that I take no pleasure in this. Your father was a colleague of mine, and his passing was a genuine loss." She looked at him steadily. "Thank you for coming," she said. Something moved briefly in his eyes. He had expected other words from her. He was recalibrating. She watched him do it and said nothing further, and he moved past her and into the conference room with his 2 attorneys following. August watched this exchange without comment. Then he said quietly, "He is good at that," at what she said. "Making cruelty sound like consideration," August said. The hearing convener was a county official named Marsh, a compact woman in her 50s with reading glasses on a chain and the air of someone who had seen most varieties of human behavior and was not surprised by any of them. She opened the proceeding at 9:02 and explained its purpose and scope and the ground rules in a clear, unhurried voice that Sarah appreciated. There was a court reporter. There were 2 chairs on each side of the central table. Sarah sat on one side with August. Voss sat on the other with his 2 attorneys. There was a third chair on Sarah's side that was empty. Voss's lead attorney opened. He was a man named Derek Fallow, polished and precise, and he laid out the case with the efficiency of someone who had put it together carefully. Thomas Mills, in the months before his death, had engaged Raymond Voss to facilitate a land transfer arrangement. In the course of that arrangement, Thomas had signed a preliminary agreement granting Voss's development company a right of first refusal on the Mills property, meaning that if the property was ever offered for sale, Voss had the right to match any offer and complete the purchase. Fallow presented the document. He presented what he said was Thomas's signature. He said the right of first refusal had been triggered by the county's back tax notice, which constituted an effective offer of sale. He said Sarah's payment of the taxes did not extinguish Voss's rights under the agreement. He said the development company was prepared to honor the original $5,000 figure and complete the transfer immediately. He sat back. Voss looked at Sarah with the expression of a man who has finished a sentence and is waiting for the period. Marsh looked at Sarah. "Miss Mills, your response." Sarah opened her jacket and took out the folded photograph she had printed at the library the previous afternoon. She slid it across the table to Marsh. "The date on that document," she said. "The date of Thomas Mills's signature. Thomas Mills died on March the 4th of this year. The signature on that document is dated March the 15th. Fallow did not visibly react. "We are aware of the date discrepancy," he said. "Our position is that the document reflects an agreement that was made verbally prior to Mr. Mills' passing and was formalized by whom Sarah said. If my father was dead on March the 4th, who formalized it on March the 15th, Fallow's jaw tightened very slightly. The formalization was completed by an authorized representative. She set down the second photograph. "This is the arrangement agreement in full," she said. "The signature authorization clause names Thomas Mills as the sole authorized signatory. There is no provision for a representative." She paused. "Someone signed my dead father's name to a legal document 11 days after he died. I would like to know who that was. I imagine the court reporter would also like to know." The room was quiet. Marsh was looking at the photographs with her reading glasses on, now comparing dates with the methodical attention of someone who understands that the details are where the truth lives. Voss spoke for the first time. His voice was still smooth. "Miss Mills," he said, "I understand this is difficult. You are young and this is a complicated situation, and I think we can find an arrangement that serves everyone's interests. The property as it stands is a liability. The house is condemned. The land is worth significantly more to a developer than it will ever be to you personally. I am prepared to increase our offer to $20,000, which is well above market." She looked at him. She let him finish. Then she said, "You were at the construction site on the day my father died." He went very still. She had not planned to say this here. She had not planned to say it at all, not today. But she had watched his face during Fallow's presentation, and she had seen the thing she was looking for, the quality of attention of a man who was not listening to new information, but reviewing a performance he had already rehearsed. And she thought about August's quiet words in the hallway. She wanted him to know that she knew, even if she could not prove it yet. His stillness lasted 3 seconds. Then he turned to Fallow with an expression of measured patience, and Fallow said, "Miss Mills, that is a serious and unsupported allegation." "I am not making an allegation," she said. "I am asking a question. Were you at the construction site on the day my father died?" "This line of inquiry is not relevant to the current proceeding," Fallow said. Marsh looked up from the photographs. She looked at Voss, then at Sarah, then at the photographs again. She said, "Mr. Fallow, I would like to understand the chain of custody for this document, specifically the authorization for the March 15th signature." Fallow began an answer that had the quality of something constructed rather than recalled. The conference room door opened. Judge Lenora Hargrove walked in. She was 61 years old, and she had the bearing of a federal judge, which is a specific kind of bearing, the posture of someone who has spent decades being the final word in a room and has made peace with the weight of that. She was a tall woman, dark-suited silver at her temples, and she moved with the economy of motion, of someone who does not waste effort on performance. She was not in robes, she was not here in an official capacity, and she would be the first to say so. She was here as a private citizen. She had driven from Chicago the night before. She sat down in the empty chair beside Sarah without speaking, placed a manila envelope on the table in front of her, and looked at Voss with the expression of a woman who has read a great many documents and understood all of them and is not impressed by the one currently on the table. "Who is this fellow?" said. "My name is Lenora Hargrove," she said. "I am here as a private citizen and as a material witness to the history of the Mills property." She paused. "I am also a federal judge, which is not relevant to these proceedings, but which I mention for the sake of complete disclosure." The silence in the room had a different quality now. It was the silence of Voss doing rapid arithmetic and arriving at a sum he did not like. "Marsh," said Judge Hargrove, "are you prepared to offer testimony relevant to this proceeding?" "I am," the judge said. She opened the manila envelope. "I am prepared to testify to the character and intent of Samuel Nathaniel Mills, the original deed holder of the property in question, and to introduce documentation pertaining to the original title and the conditions of that title." She removed a document and placed it on the table. "This is a sworn affidavit executed by Samuel Mills on October 13th, 1959, attested to by a notary of record, establishing the terms of ownership and transfer of the Mills property, and explicitly prohibiting its sale or transfer outside the direct family line without unanimous consent of living descendants." Fallow leaned forward. "That document has no bearing on a right of first refusal agreement executed 65 years later." "An agreement with a forged signature," Sarah said. Fallow looked at her. She held his look. "The affidavit predates any subsequent agreement," Judge Hargrove said, in the measured voice of someone who has written a great many legal opinions. "If the affidavit is valid, and I have had it examined by two colleagues in property law who believe it is then no arrangement entered into by any heir of Samuel Mills can supersede the original restriction on transfer. Any right of first refusal granted by Thomas Mills would be void from its inception regardless of the validity of the signature." She paused. "And the signature," she said, "is not valid." The room was quiet again. Voss had not moved. He was looking at the affidavit on the table with the expression of a man watching a wall he built, carefully come apart in a specific and irreversible way. His jaw was set. His hands on the table were flat and still. Marsh said, "Mr. Voss, do you have a response to the affidavit?" Voss said slowly, "I would need time to have this document examined." "Of course," Marsh said. She looked at Fallow. "Counselor, the date discrepancy on the signature is a matter I will be referring to the county attorney's office for review." She took off her reading glasses and let them hang on the chain. "I am not in a position to rule on the validity of the right of first refusal agreement today, given the questions that have been raised. However, I am prepared to issue a preliminary finding that the Mills property is not subject to any disposition order pending resolution of those questions. Miss Mills retains full possession." She stamped a form. The sound of it was very clean in the quiet room. Voss stood. His two attorneys stood with him. He picked up his briefcase and he buttoned his jacket, and he looked at Sarah across the table. She looked back at him. She did not look away. She did not look triumphant or relieved or any of the things she might have been expected to look. She looked at him with the clear, steady attention of someone who is paying close attention to something they intend to remember. He left without speaking. Fallow gathered his documents and followed, and the second attorney followed Fallow, and the door closed behind them with the quiet firmness of a thing that has been settled. The room exhaled. August Bryn, who had sat throughout the entire proceeding without speaking, placed his large hands flat on the table and breathed out slowly through his nose. It was the breath of a man who has been holding something for a very long time and is finally putting it down. Judge Hargrove looked at Sarah. She said, "That was well done." Sarah said, "You drove from Chicago last night." The judge looked at the affidavit still on the table. "My father," she said, and stopped. She tried again. "My father spent 40 years trying to find out who his family owed. He said it was the one debt he could never repay because he could never find where to send the payment. She paused. He died not knowing. Sarah reached into her jacket and took out the page she had brought for this purpose. A photograph of the entry in Samuel's journal, the one dated winter 1952. Family of 3. Safe passage arranged. Western route. Beside it, in Samuel's careful notation, a single letter. H. She placed it in front of Judge Hargrove. His name was Samuel Mills, Sarah said. He was a farmer, and he believed that most problems in the world had a solution if you were willing to do the work and not ask for recognition afterward. The judge looked at the photograph for a long time. When she looked up, her eyes were the eyes of someone who has just received something they had given up expecting. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was still precise, but it was also, underneath the precision, the voice of Edmund Hargrove's daughter, who had grown up hearing a story with a missing piece and was now holding the piece in her hands. They sat in the conference room for another hour after Marsh had gone, and the court reporter had packed up and left. August talked about the barn, about the 11 days his family had spent in the underground room in the winter of 1952, about Samuel's wife bringing food down through the hatch at mealtimes, always warm, always more than enough. About the sound of the farm above them, the ordinary sounds of a working life, animals and equipment and the footsteps of a family going about its days as though nothing unusual was happening below their floor. About the night he had heard voices outside, and his father had put a hand over his mouth in the dark, and they had all stayed perfectly still, not breathing, for what felt like hours. He talked about the morning they left. Samuel had risen before dawn and brought them through the back of the property and into the tree line, and along a path that he knew in the dark, the way you know things you have walked 1,000 times. He had arrangements waiting. He had shaken each person's hand, including August, who was 7 years old, and he had said in the particular way of a man who does not make speeches, "You are going to be all right now." And then he had walked back to his farm, and they had not seen him again. "You were 7, Sarah said. "I was 7, August said. "But I remembered everything. Children remember the things that matter even when they do not yet know why they matter." Judge Hargrove listened to all of this without speaking. When August finished, she said, "My father told me one thing about those 11 days. He said he had never in his life before or after felt as safe as he felt in that room. He said the floor above them was the safest floor he had ever been under." The room was quiet, with the particular quiet of people sitting inside something true. Then she said, "What are you going to do with the property?" Sarah had been thinking about this for 4 days. She had been thinking about it since she first read Thomas's letter in the amber light of the barn, the letter in which he described the Harlan Foundation. She had been thinking about it in the mornings when she walked the property line in the gray light and looked at the wild meadow and the sound timber of the barn and the condemned house that was only condemned because no one had cared enough to fix it. She said there was a nonprofit my father was working with, the Harlan Foundation. He was arranging to work with them on a residential facility for families in transition. She paused. "I am not going to give them the property, but I am going to do what he had in mind. I am going to fix the house, and I am going to work with them, and I am going to run it myself." She paused again. "I have the money to start. I have the barn. I have the skills I need to learn, and enough time to learn them." She looked at August. "And I have people who know the history of this place and can tell it to anyone who needs to understand what they are walking into." August looked at her with the creek water eyes that had seen a great deal of the world and had not been made cynical by any of it. "Samuel would have called that the right decision," he said. "He would have said exactly that and nothing more. He was not a man who used more words than the situation required." The 3 of them walked out of the municipal building into the afternoon. The square was quiet, a weekday in a small town. A few cars, a woman pushing a stroller, the hardware store with its door propped open against the warm day. August walked to his car, which was a very old pickup truck, the color of dry grass, and said goodbye with the particular brevity of a man who understood that some goodbyes were not endings. Judge Hargrove walked to a rental car and paused before getting in. She said, "I would like to come back, if that would be all right, to see the room." "Whenever you want," Sarah said. The judge nodded. She said, "The debt my family owes cannot be repaid. I want you to know that I understand that." What Samuel Mills did was not the kind of thing that has an equivalent in any currency I know of. Sarah said, "He did not do it to be repaid. You know that." "I know," the judge said, "but I am going to be useful to you anyway." She paused. Property law, federal questions. If Raymond Voss tries another angle, and men like him tend to try other angles, you call me. She got in the car and drove away. Sarah stood in the square for a moment. Then she bought a sandwich at the diner, a real one this time, hot turkey on sourdough, and she sat at the counter and ate it slowly and looked out the window at the street and let the afternoon settle around her. The woman behind the counter refilled her coffee without being asked. "That was from the hearing today, honey," she said. "About the Mills place." Sarah looked at her. "Small town," the woman said, not apologetically. "News moves," she paused. "You keeping it?" "Keeping it," Sarah said. The woman nodded as though this was the correct answer to a question she had been waiting to hear answered for some time. "Good," she said, and went back to her work. Sarah finished the sandwich and walked back to the farm. The afternoon light was low and warm as she came through the tree tunnel and onto the property, making everything it touched look like something worth preserving. She stopped at the edge of the meadow and looked at the barn. She had been looking at it for 4 days now from various angles and in various lights, and each time it looked different. This evening it looked in the long rays of the late sun like something that had been patient rather than merely still. There is a difference between those two things. Stillness is the absence of motion. Patience is the presence of waiting. The barn had been waiting. She went inside. She stood in the center of the barn floor and turned slowly, taking in the full sweep of the space. The uncovered equipment that she had begun to catalog. The high beams overhead. The pegboard with its remaining tools. The workbench where Thomas had sat and written to her. The oak flooring under the bench replaced and unremarkable to any eye that did not know what it was covering. She walked to the workbench and sat on it the way she had been doing in the evenings, her legs dangling, and she looked at the barn around her and thought about the 3 people who had shaped it. Samuel, who built it into something more than a barn and sealed it away to protect his son. Thomas, who found it and carried it alone and tried to figure out what to do with it and ran out of time. And herself 4 days ago, standing in the weeds outside with a key and $112 and the reasonable expectation that she would sell this land and start over somewhere without history. She reached up and took the hammer from the pegboard. It was the one with the worn handle darkened with decades of grip. Thomas's hammer, she was certain of it now. She turned it in her hands. It had the weight of a tool that had been used seriously for a long time, that perfect worn balance that settles into the palm like it belongs there. She stood up. She carried the hammer outside and around to the front of the property, to the place where the condemned house waited with its collapsed center and its rotted porch and its boarded windows. She stood in front of it for a long moment. Then she pulled the first board from the nearest window. It came away in a spray of dry rot and a cloud of dust that made her cough. She pulled the second board, the third. The window behind them was cracked but whole, and through it she could see the interior of the house for the first time, dim and cluttered with the debris of neglect, a century of settling and water damage, and the patient work of things that grow in the dark. She pulled the fourth board, the fifth. She worked until the light was almost gone, and she had cleared 3 of the downstairs windows, and when she stopped, she could see into the house from 3 angles, and what she saw was not ruin. It was a structure. Walls that were damaged but standing. Flooring that was soft in places but present. A staircase that leaned but held. She sat on the porch steps, the ones that were still solid, and looked out at the meadow in the fading light. The wildflowers in the meadow had closed for the evening. The birds were finishing their last conversations. Somewhere in the tree line, a frog had begun its night sound. She was dirty and her hands hurt, and she was precisely where she was supposed to be. She went back to the barn and washed her hands in the bucket of water she kept by the side door, and sat on the floor and opened the army box on the workbench. She took out Thomas's last letter, the one she had read a dozen times now, and read it again. Not because she needed to, because she wanted to. She read the part where he said he was coming in the spring. She read the part where he said she deserved to know what this place was before she decided what it was worth. She read the last lines. All my love. Always. I am coming in the spring. She folded the letter and held it and breathed. The grief was still there. She did not expect it to stop being there, but it had changed again the way grief does when you have been carrying it long enough to understand its shape. It was not the grief of abandonment anymore. It was the grief of proximity, of how close things had come to being different, of the spring that had not arrived. That kind of grief was something you kept and learned to carry alongside the living, not instead of it. Thomas had taught her that without meaning to, in the letters he had written to a daughter he never got to know. She put the letter back. She thought about what came next, the practical architecture of what she was undertaking. The house needed roof work before anything else. She had watched enough tutorial videos in the past 4 days to understand that much. The center beam had given way, and the structure around it was sound enough to work with, but the beam was the first thing. After the beam, the subroof. After that, the exterior walls. Then the interior room by board, the way you do any large thing, which is by not looking at all of it at once, but by doing the next piece and then the next. She had $48,000 remaining after the taxes. She would spend carefully, and she would learn what she could not afford to hire, and she would hire what she could not learn quickly enough. She had time. The county had cleared the property and the development claim was in collapse, and Raymond Voss would face questions that she suspected would occupy him for some considerable time to come. She had time, and she had money, and she had a barn full of her great-grandfather's tools and a house full of her great-grandfather's bones and 112 years of family history to work with. She would learn the skills. That was not a question. It was a fact about her that she was only now beginning to articulate clearly. She had taught herself to pick a lock in an evening. She had taught herself to read the language of old construction by looking at it closely and thinking about what it was trying to do. She would learn to work with wood and stone and old iron the way the people in her family had worked with them. Not because she was trying to be them, but because they were the ones who had left her the tools, and the tools wanted using. 6 months later, a small boy named Felix sat in the grass in the meadow and watched a caterpillar make its way across a milkweed stem with the absolute concentration of a 4-year-old encountering something new. His mother sat on the porch of the main house, which had a new roof and 3 repaired windows, and a porch that was level now and solid underfoot. And she was drinking coffee and watching her son in the meadow with the expression of a woman who is doing something as simple as watching her child in the morning and finding it almost unbearable in how good it is. The main house was not finished. It would not be finished for another year at least. But the ground floor was habitable, 3 rooms and a kitchen and a bathroom that Sarah had plumbed herself after watching 12 tutorial videos and making 3 significant mistakes that she had then fixed. The family, Felix and his mother and the mother's sister, had arrived 6 weeks ago through the Harlan Foundation, which had sent its director, a compact woman named Ruth Alcott, to meet Sarah 2 months after the hearing. Ruth Alcott had sat at the workbench in the barn and listened to the history of the place with the expression of someone receiving something they had been hoping for without knowing quite what it looked like. She had said, "Your father told me about Samuel." She had said it quietly. "I want you to know that I did not push him. He came to us. And when he described this barn and what it had been, I understood immediately why he thought we might want to be involved." She had paused then, choosing her next words with care. "Samuel Mills is not unknown to people who study this kind of history," she said. "There are records and archives that keep records of such things. What he did during those years was documented by some of the families he helped after the fact, after it was safe to speak. He is considered among people who know this chapter of history to be someone who acted at significant personal risk for no personal gain during a period when such activity was genuinely dangerous." She paused again. "There are people who would consider this property a significant place. I wanted you to know that before you decided how to use it." Sarah had thought about it. She had thought about it for several days. Then she had called Judge Hargrove and asked her opinion, which had become something she did occasionally now. Not because she needed permission, but because the judge's perspective was precise and useful and came from someone who had examined a great many difficult situations and thought carefully about all of them. The judge had said, "It is your property and your family's history. What do you want it to be?" She had said, "I want it to be what it was. A place people can stay until they find their footing. Not a museum, a working place." The judge had said, "Then that is what it should be." August Bryn came on Wednesdays. He had appointed himself to this schedule without discussing it, simply appearing the first Wednesday after the hearing and appearing again the next one and the one after that. He was 84 years old, and he walked the property in the mornings with the deliberate pace of a man who is not walking to get somewhere, but walking to be somewhere. He talked to Felix's mother in the garden, where she was putting in a vegetable bed with seeds Sarah had ordered from a catalog she had found in the barn, seeds from a company that had been operating in the same county for 100 years. He sat on the bench outside the barn door in the afternoons and watched Sarah work and occasionally said things that turned out to be useful. He had said 2 weeks ago, while watching her struggle with a section of siding on the barn's north wall, "Your great-grandfather always set the corner piece first. Everything else adjusts to the corner." She had tried it. He had been right. She did not ask him how he knew this. She understood by now that August Bryn had spent 84 years paying attention to things that mattered and keeping them carefully, and that this was its own kind of inheritance. The inheritance of witness lives of knowledge gained by watching people who understood their work do it well. On an evening in late summer, she went into the barn after the day's work and stood at the workbench and looked at the pegboard. All the tools were on it now. She had hung them herself, the tools from Thomas's box, and the tools she had found in the barn, and the new tools she had bought over the months, as she needed them, organizing them the way Thomas had organized things by logic and use by the grammar of what went with what. The hammer was on the pegboard. She took it down and held it and looked at the barn the way she had that first evening, turning slowly to take in the full sweep of the space. The covered equipment was uncovered now. The tractor she had thought might run had been inspected by a man in town who confirmed it would run with some specific work, and she had done that work over the course of 3 weekends with the man's instruction, and the tractor ran now. The candle press sat clean and oiled in its corner. The apple mill was assembled and waiting for October. The tools on the pegboard were in use. The barn was not sleeping anymore. The underground room was intact. She had cleaned it and documented it, photographed every surface, recorded August's testimony on her phone, sent the recording and photographs to Ruth Alcott and to Judge Hargrove and to a historian at a university 2 states over who had contacted her after the judge mentioned the property to a colleague. The room was not open to visitors. It would not be, not yet, perhaps not for some years, or perhaps eventually in a form she had not yet figured out. But it was documented. The list on the wall was documented. Samuel Mill's work was documented. He had said, "Leave something behind that tells the truth and trust that truth to travel." She was trusting it. She hung the hammer back on the pegboard and walked outside into the cooling air of early evening. Felix was in the garden with his mother, and she could hear his voice from here, the particular earnest narration of a small child explaining something to an adult who is listening with real attention. His mother's laugh rose and fell and rose again. Sarah sat on the bench outside the barn door. The barn stood behind her, solid and patient. The house stood across the meadow, half restored and wholly inhabited. The property stretched out around her, the meadow and the tree line and the old fence with its new posts where she had replaced the rotted ones earlier that summer. She put her hand in her jacket pocket. The velvet pouch was still there. It was always there. She took out the iron key and held it in her palm, dark and pitted and solid heavy with what it had opened and what it had come to mean. Her great-grandfather had put it in a velvet pouch and left it in a toolbox for a daughter his son would one day have. He had not known her name or her face or what she would be like when she arrived. He had known only that she would come, and that when she came she would be the kind of person who turned the key instead of selling the lock. He had been right about her. She sat on the bench in front of her great-grandfather's barn in the last light of a summer evening and listened to the sounds of the place around her. Felix's voice in the garden, the birds settling into the tree line for the night, The sound of the creek, which she could hear clearly on quiet evenings, now moving over its stones in the constant and unconcerned way of water, which does not worry about what has happened to it or what will happen, but only does the work it was made for. Moving always forward, carrying what it carries, arriving always somewhere. She was not an orphan with nowhere to go. She was the keeper of a place that had been waiting for her. She was the great-granddaughter of a man who believed that the right thing and the hard thing were usually the same thing, and who had spent his life acting on that belief without asking for recognition. She was the daughter of a man who had loved her in silence for 18 years because he thought that was the best way to keep her safe, and who had been wrong about that in the specific and forgivable way that people are wrong when they are trying too hard to protect something they love. She was 18 years old, and she had learned more in 10 days than she had in the previous 10 years. She was learning more every day from the barn and the land, in August, in the family and the garden, in the slow demanding work of fixing something large and broken, which turned out to be almost indistinguishable from the work of building something new. She closed her fingers around the iron key and felt it settle into her palm, cold and solid and precise. The same familiar weight it had been on that first morning in the administrative office, when she had held it for the first time, and felt without yet knowing why that she could not let go of it. She knew why now. She sat with it a moment longer, feeling the history of it, the specific and particular reality of a thing that was made for a purpose, and had found that purpose after a very long time of waiting. Then she put it back in the velvet pouch. She would need it tomorrow. There was always more to open.